So I'm joined by a fantastic panel of guests today, Lina, James, Ben, and Rich. We are talking about the topic of software getting better or worse, and potentially a bit of a divisive topic here, something that I'm sure the panel are going to get into their thoughts on and really sort of knock around a little bit. So if I can start with a few introductions. Lina, as you are first on the picture, give yourself a little introduction to the folks watching.
Problem. Thank you, Ben. So my name is Lina. I'm a solutions engineer here at Curiosity. I've been here for about 3.5 years now. So I work with testing teams all day, every day to tackle their challenges together. So yeah, very much looking forward to this conversation today.
Thanks, Lina. James?
Yeah, really excited. Hi, everyone. I'm James Walker, CEO and co-founder of Curiosity Software. I guess I've been in DevOps for the past kind of decade now, which is a little bit scary, but mostly I've been working with organizations to help to optimize their software delivery and focus on delivery productivity.
Thanks, James. That number will only get larger, mate. I enjoy that.
Oh, yeah.
My namesake, Mr. Ben Johnson Ward.
Namesake. Okay. So yeah, I've also been in DevOps for about the last decade, long-time user of software. I'm not sure if it's getting better or worse, but it'll be an interesting discussion to get into some of the finer points of that.
Fantastic. And last but not least, Rich Jordan.
Cheers, Ben. So Rich Jordan, I'm an enterprise solutions architect here at Curiosity. I help people implement some of our tooling, but focus more on the people and the process side of things, looking at the challenges that inevitably most organizations suffer where they look for tool solutions, but we get into kind of people and process mechanisms as well. Previous to joining Curiosity, I worked in delivery capacity, mostly in financial services, where more towards the latter time, I was very involved with quality transformations within financial services.
Fantastic. Thanks, Rich. Good to have everybody. Thank you all. One sort of final note, throughout the webinar, we will be putting up a few polls, a few sort of bits for people to answer. Feel free to stick in your details and we'll bring that up as we sort of go. So we start off. James, going to check this first kind of question to you. So the title is Software Getting Better or Worse? Is it the same? Is it industry specific? Is it just an illusion of where we are in terms of technology today? What do we think? Is software getting better or is it getting worse?
Wow, we're going straight for it. I'm going to kind of cop out a little bit here and go for a third option, I think, which is I actually think software's always been bad. I know a lot of us on this webinar probably can go back and remember, kind of the very early days. I think my first experience with computing was with Windows 3.1. That then obviously progressed into Windows 95, etc. And if I go back and look then, almost every day you would get some kind of blue screen of death, right? You would lose all your work, you haven't saved it, and, it would be a massive headache to go back through and try and redo everything that you've done before. So I think from my perspective, it's more thinking about kind of what's changed. I think what's happened now is almost the entire world is run on software, right? So when there is some kind of failure or something goes wrong, the impact is much, much greater. We saw that, 3 months ago now with CrowdStrike, where it took down, loads of the airports, etc. People couldn't make planes, they couldn't go in and do their banking, etc. And these are pretty commonplace, right? I think one of the things not a lot of people realize, on that same day that CrowdStrike went down, there was a big Microsoft outage as well. And actually that was all masked by everything that happened, right? So I think that's number one, is it's more visible than ever. Everyone turned to social media. If you went on BBC, you turned on any news channel, it was all over it. So I think with much more visibility into a lot of the failures that are happening. I also think the expectation from consumers is much higher. If I go now and I go into my banking application and it doesn't work, or it's not intuitive to use, the likelihood is I'm going to think about, is this the right bank for me to be using? And is it, the financial organization I want to be banking with, right? And I'm probably going to go and switch to a different provider, which kind of brings me on to my third point, is I think there's even more competition than ever before. To me, it's all of those three things are kind of aligned. And coming back to the original question, I think it's always been bad, but we rely on software much more. Software is so much integrated into our daily lives. And I think we just have much more visibility into the impact of things going wrong, right? It's the same problems, just bigger amplifier, way more well known.
Yeah. Yeah, it's a good answer. Ben, what do you reckon?
So James, you're basically saying that it's at least it's a salience bias, which I think I kind of agree with. I think sometimes working in the other direction, I do think that your average user is probably better at debugging things themselves and working around things themselves than they ever have been before, right? Whether it's, if you're in a browser, zooming in or out, or trying it in incognito, or changing some of your settings, or refreshing it, etc. I'm not convinced that people in the early 2000s or the 90s were trying all of that. So I do think some users are probably a little bit more resilient, but our bigger systems clearly are much more vulnerable than they were before. I think the other thing in maybe defense of software engineers, I don't think software engineers have gotten worse. I think some of their goals have shifted in terms of how often do we deploy, what is the actual cost to a bug, right? The reason why the thing was so impactful was that we couldn't patch it, right? Every single physical machine had to be physically updated for the most part because it was a blue screen on boot. If something is, a little bit annoying on your iPhone, the total impact is going to be how quickly can you fix it? How much is the impact in the interim? How quickly did they notice it? So one of the things that probably has got better overall is monitoring. Maybe not as much of an improvement as we would want. But if you compare it to, say, for example, when every piece of software, you release it and then that's shipped on the CD and it better not have a bunch of problems, people were probably taking a different approach. So maybe we're just at a different point on a risk-reward spectrum than we were before. I'm pretty confident that software developers overall haven't, net got worse, but there are more of them, and some of them are taking more of a risky attitude than maybe they would have done in some of the earlier days of software, where a bigger proportion of software was on those, high frequency kind of banking applications, those system of record applications where any bug is going to be much more impactful than your average website.
Good answer. Lina, what do you reckon? What's your take?
I don't know if it's like the perpetual American optimism in me, but I think it's getting better. And I think that's maybe just based on the fact that it's incredible what software can do. When I think about it, I'm like, wow, it can do anything. And that's amazing. I would argue that maybe process and structure surrounding it have a lot of issues. So for the CrowdStrike example, I read this really interesting article about what they did in test. And essentially it came down to the fact that in the language that they were using, there's a length of arrays that must be treated and checked separately. And the old version had 20, the new version had 21. No one caught that because they only did happy path testing and they only did valid data as well. And that's how it slipped through the cracks. In my mind, it's a testing problem. It's a operations problem of not having this quality mechanism in place. But what software itself is capable of, I would argue it's gotten only better and better with the, things such as AI and machine learning. I think it's incredible what it's capable of, but we need a bit of structure around it as well.
Keep optimistic. That's not a problem at all. Rich, what do you reckon? So you've spent time across the ton of software in finance. What's your kind of take?
So again, better or worse, don't know. But I think a lot, almost like James, I think we've always been pretty rubbish at defining what quality actually is. And I still think we are pretty rubbish at defining what quality is at an individual software level, right? So when organizations have built something in the past, heavy days of waterfall, a lot of it is very functionally heavy and the other things don't come into it, right? And so you get very late in the day and nothing has been defined, whether non-functional is a dirty word or not. All of those utilities things don't get defined until someone maybe says at the very end, or they're just forgotten. Right? And I know, two people have mentioned the CrowdStrike thing already, right? And again, what do we mean by quality? Resilience. Again, something that isn't really considered. And lots of things are very flaky. Things go wrong very, very often because resilience doesn't form part of that conversation when these things are being developed. All right. I think from a kind of an end user point of view, I think where technology has evolved, everything is 24/7, everything is connected now, right? And so not necessarily quality, but the impact of failure is far more visible than it ever was. In the world of organizations 20 years ago, a lot of it was batch, right? A lot of it happened overnight. And so if something went wrong, you could mask it. But yeah, as soon as something goes wrong today, it becomes very visible. And social media then exemplifies those things going wrong and everybody all of a sudden has known about it. Whereas 20 years ago, batch job might have gone wrong at 2 o'clock in the morning. You could call the guy on, on call, and they'd be fixed by 6 o'clock, 7 o'clock in the morning, and that batch job would run, and no one was any of the wiser. And so I still think some of these things are happening. It's just that real-time element of it makes it a hell of a lot more visible. I also think where organizations haven't necessarily got a good architecture refresh regime, there's a lot of complexity in terms of legacy systems that bolt on new technology. And so these systems are getting more and more complex, right? And so there is a need, or there is a desire to release these things ever quicker. But that complexity, how to handle that complexity, to Ben's point, that risk reward, how do you weigh up how much effort you put into the risk of something going wrong? I think there's a lot of organizations that either struggle with that conversation or don't even have that conversation because they aren't aware of the risks they're putting themselves under.
Yeah, makes sense. Definitely makes sense. So let's take maybe a different angle to the question then. Ben, you mentioned that in the realm of developers, there's more developers now than ever. James, I think you've probably got a bit of experience in this as well. What's your sort of take in terms of, I guess, the developer experience, right? There's more technology, there's more opportunity, there's more different types of role that can get involved with software development and the rest of it. But why do you think that with such an influx of, potential talent, right, and developers in this space, why does the associated quality of that software not necessarily go up then? Like, why do we still think that maybe it's in a bad state?
It's interesting. I mean, Ben made an interesting point earlier about, software being shipped on CDs, and that was a high pressure environment. I actually think the way we deliver software now is probably equally, or if not more, high pressure. It's just a different type of pressure. Most organizations, they're trying to release more often. Some organizations are trying to deliver daily, right, to their SaaS cloud environments, etc. Honestly, from my perspective, I'm just really surprised we don't see more people burn out in this industry, because to get to that stage where you're releasing that often, it's so much hard work. There's so much risk. And I think for a lot of organizations, when they try and move that fast, they just end up in such a mess, right? Because every time you make a commit, every time you change a line of code, you have to understand what the impact of that change is, right? And, it used to be much easier because, the architecture was much slimmer. We used to have monolith architectures. The applications weren't as big. You didn't have as many libraries you were pulling in, etc. But you look at the landscape now, and, microservices is a big thing, right? I think I read somewhere recently, Netflix has something like 1,200 microservice APIs, which is a hugely complex architecture to go out and develop against, and also test against to make sure we have quality, right? You look at the technological landscape now, we've moved from databases to NoSQL databases. Some applications don't even have a concept of database they're connecting into. There's such a maze of different architectures, different technologies that you have to get your head around to even make the slightest movement forward, right? So I just think it's incredibly hard, right? And then you try to wrap in there, how can we move fast and maintain quality? And I just think it's virtually impossible, right? There's so many almost anti-patterns, I think, that people are trying to follow. Like you see on LinkedIn, people say, move fast and break things. That's the way to go. And I just think actually slow down a little bit, focus on quality, and let's deliver quality software, right? And that needs to be the mission statement. And I think a lot of people are just trying to move as fast as they can, and that's just a big anti-pattern.
Agree?
I mostly agree. I think when it comes to specifically the developer experience, with great power comes great responsibility. When it comes to say a cloud environment and building on there, that is fundamentally different. If you look at, for example, some of the big issues that happened with GitLab and things like that, it was a developer who was, in a high pressure moment trying to recover a service who had essentially 2 SQL windows open, and the one that he was not meant to wipe down was the database that he destroyed. And they lost not just downtime, but hours of real data. And if you think about that person was essentially an individual, a developer in a non-live service, or maybe in not the kind of current culture of, there is a certain level of trust in every developer, where you consider the amount of company reputation you're funneling through one person's keystrokes on their machine, and that machine in that environment is not built to, for example, in the document they wrote afterwards about how to prevent this in the future, other than just permissions and things like that, one of the things was literally having the SQL windows be different colors, right? So you think maybe we could build a developer experience where that kind of I'm in the wrong one is just much, some of these mistakes shouldn't be possible for an individual person to commit. And they are now like literally a global scale serving hundreds of millions of users. So if you think, okay, yes, we can have all sorts of resilience and monitoring, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. But if at the end of it, the power of one individual scales to such an extent that they could essentially genuinely change the valuation of a company with an accidental keystroke, then that's actually, from a developer experience point of view, that's a risk point.
Makes sense. Yeah. And it's marginally terrifying, right? It's one of those things. Let's just, I guess, move the script a little bit in terms of AI, right? So I know this is either a part of the conversation you'll love or hate, right? I know there's lots of views on it. Rich, what's your sort of take on the impact on kind of software quality when it comes to AI? Does it help? Does it not help? Is it irrelevant?
Well, it's early days, I think, is the very short answer. If you look at kind of the applications in the wild, if you like, right, there's some really good things around, in medicine, for example, around cancer screening and things like that, where they are doing some really good things, right? And I think more of that, the more improved AI can get, the better that kind of avenue can go. On the very flip side of that, again, on user experience, and I'm personal experience of this, you get into the realms of, ironically, customer service and AI bots. All right. And so it's become absolutely impossible to actually talk to somebody from an organization to raise a concern or raise a query around something because you get involved with AI bots. And it's really frustrating. And I fear that, a lot of the feedback on that is lost because ultimately people don't want to engage in that. And therefore there is no feedback. And therefore this proliferation of cheap AI bots doing AI around these kind of things inevitably will get more prolific, and the end user experience will just dwindle. From a kind of development point of view, which I think is probably where the question was more aimed at, inevitably, I think where you've got kind of your co-pilot element of it, your very structured, low-level AI assistant kind of thing. Again, I think there's some real good strides being made around that being a force for good in terms of being more efficient, perhaps more accurate in terms of the ability to create new resources like code. The key there being a co-pilot rather than replacing. And I think there's kind of alluding to the danger there in that a lot of the conversations we have from a realm of testing, for example, the saying goes, will AI replace us? I think that's silly. I think the saying around AI won't replace, but the person using AI will. I think there's some really good things around and I touch on the growing complexity element of systems going on here. AI can do a lot of things around pattern matching. We mentioned the medical screening thing earlier on, around understanding how systems work, understanding how error logs come up with patterns around how things go wrong. There's a hell of a lot of data, some of it unstructured, some of it really structured, where AI can give us really good insights that some of us are plugging into, some of us not so much. A lot of that information exists today, but no one is actually plugging into it. So I think giving development teams insight around failure points or giving them insight around cognitive load of how systems work, I think there's massive opportunity there from an AI perspective.
Yeah. Any more comments from the team on AI? Like I'd quite like to sort of box it in a little bit in terms of the webinar.
I think the one thing I would say about that is it's clearly like an increase in capabilities, but with a commensurate increase in risk in two ways, right? One is it poses new quality challenges just by itself. In terms of the applications we're building, we're not going to leave that power on the side. People are going to use it. So because of the way that they're built and some of the inconsistencies they have and some of the things we're trying to do, they do pose their own risks right now. That's the one side. On the other side, in terms of like adhering to checklists and checking all the way, there's definitely ways we could use it, which could increase quality. So the power is definitely a net benefit. How that will actually eventually be used, or if people kind of take the first thing that it suggests to it, paste it in and hit run without thinking it through, if they kind of put a little bit too much trust in it, at least today, that also poses risk. But the net power is probably a good thing, I would say.
I agree with the power. I think it's incredibly powerful, even where we are today. And I do strongly believe that, the technology available is just going to get better and better. I think my biggest kind of frustration at the moment is just looking and seeing where the focus is with AI right now. If you look at where all the investment is being made, all the hype, it's all around AI-based coding. And I think that's really interesting. I love developing code. I think GitHub Copilot is fantastic. But do I think that is the top challenge in software delivery right now, is developers being able to write code? No, I think developers are very good at writing code as it is today. There's kind of a bit of a joke in the industry at the moment that every day spent developing code with AI, it takes 3 days to test it, right? AI hallucinates, there's all these challenges, et cetera, and I just think that just sums up where we are as an industry, right? There is such a problem with quality. There's such a problem with being able to keep up with the rate of change from a sense of quality, being able to test it, et cetera. Why are we focusing all our energy on AI being able to write code? It just seems nuts to me. It doesn't make sense, right?
That's interesting, right? So let's just leave off that a little bit. And we'll just talk to maybe some of the experiences we've had. Like, I don't know if people have had, they've had some experiences with sort of software failures. And I suspect maybe more specifically, when I worked in NHS support, I remember getting a ticket through where a booking system had gone down, and for a particular series of appointments, it was all grayed out. That's quite a big problem, right? You've got, everyone's been to the doctors, you go stand in a queue or whatever to try and get checked in or find a booking, and you get, you can't. That's not ideal. So whenever we get those tickets, quite a priority, so on and so forth. What had actually happened is the user had just scrolled all the way accidentally to the bottom of the screen. So it was just grey list because it's the middle of the night and there were no appointments there. So do we think, so it's not the software's fault. The software was working. Well done. NHS software at that particular point. I'm sure there's more horror stories, but the user, had made a mistake. That's fine. Do we think sometimes, Lina, I'm going to start with you here. Do we think sometimes our expectations are a little bit too high when it comes to software, or do we think that there's a level of this that is, I guess, training, interactions, like other elements that should kind of come into play? And a follow-up question before you even answer it. Have you had some experiences, I guess, with software failures that made you laugh, made you cry?
Yeah, so I guess in terms of like personal experiences, I've been on booking.com, things like that, not specifically that site, but something similar where you can book travel. And I've had it completely fail before, and I was traveling between countries, so that was incredibly stressful. So I would say, high risk, high consequence website, that's a really big personal issue that I think impacts a lot of consumers. There is actually one, I wouldn't say it's a software failure yet, but I think it could be in the future, which is somewhat related to what CrowdStrike recently went through, where I believe the issue was something at a kernel level. And I noticed that with online video games that are trying to do anti-cheat programs, they're all at the kernel level. And I think a lot of people probably installed it and accepted that, oh, it's okay, I can trust this company, I can trust that this is a good thing, it's to prevent cheating. But actually, it leaves your system really vulnerable to attacks because it's at the most, bottom level of your machine. So I think it's interesting. I think there's a lot more, but you wouldn't know that unless you worked specifically in IT. And I didn't know that until I saw an article about it. So I think there's all of these things that we sort of have this implicit trust for, where if I make a booking on a website for a hotel, that's going to work. But if I show up and that hotel doesn't exist, that's a problem. Or accept this software update without really critically thinking about what it might do to my machine. I just think there's a lot of high risk situations now, and that's the problem.
I agree. Absolutely agreed. Let's just talk a little bit about first impressions, maybe, because I think this is another element, right? Your first impression of a website, your first impression of a new piece of software. What do you think? What's sort of the impact of that going wrong? Rich, let's maybe start with you first, sort of finance, and then we'll jump off.
Can I just touch on the previous question as well?
Please do.
I guess there's a certain cultural element to failure, right? And even to the point where modern development methodologies are iterative delivery. To a certain extent, we should expect failure, right? And it's all about our ability to then recover from failure. But technology-wise, but also culturally, right? I think I've been within organizations that have had internal failures and externally facing failures as well, right? And there's an element around nothing is foolproof, nothing can be fully tested, and therefore you might expect there to be some kind of issues at some point, right? I think the interesting part there is your ability to then, as a team, come together to do that root cause analysis to understand why that happened, so you can prevent that in the past. And I don't just mean around how do you add another test to a certain test pattern or something like that, right? But actually, how do you start to have those early open conversations about what could possibly go wrong during the design phase, and that float all the way through. I think there is a danger that in organizations where the culture isn't right, scapegoats quickly get pointed at, and all those conversations go away, right? And so everybody is covering their own backsides. Nothing actually gets resolved for the future, and therefore you are no resilient, both as a team, as an organization, but also that software becomes no more resilient either. To your question there about first impressions, I think it's an interesting one when you talk about financial services. Right? If anybody on this webinar is listening from financial services, I'm sure, especially from more traditional financial services, you will have gone through some kind of transformation over the past 10 years, maybe, where the underlying kind of reason for that transformation is that the fintechs are going to take your work, right? And because they can pivot really fast, they can add new functionality to their web apps really, really quickly, and quite right? It's an interesting one around the new functionality that your Revoluts can add and your Monzos can add, and, all of that mobile capability that the kind of the more agile fintech organization can pivot to very, very quickly. And more traditional organizations, they struggle with that because they've got this complexity, they've got this legacy problem. I think there's an interesting dynamic, being a bit cynical around the whole fintech will take all your kind of money going forward, in terms of that's just looking at end user kind of mobile app feature factory kind of stuff. And then what you don't get into necessarily is the resiliency of certain things. What's more important to you, having 24-hour, 7 days a week access to your money, or having a new feature on your phone? Right? And again, some of these things get lost in the ether, where actually what is important from a first impressions for my whole engagement with this financial services organization. The mobile app might be the front door. It might not be for a lot of other, I guess we're getting into generational kind of, how do you interact with certain financial services organizations? I think a lot of that is lost in the ether. It comes back to my original point, right? In terms of when we're talking about quality, whose quality do we actually mean? Right? Because everybody has got a different perspective. And I'm not saying that we should concentrate on a certain one. I'm just saying that those early conversations, that psychological safety that I was just talking about there, should really kind of have those conversations so everybody really understands, who are we interested in when we're talking about quality, and actually who are we not? Because there's an important part there in terms of, you can try and gold plate everything, but actually you're not really interested in an organization around certain elements, and that's all right.
James, you look like you wanted to dive in about halfway through there. What were you going to say?
No, I was just listening to Rich there. I think, to me, a lot of this just comes down to risk, right? And I think Lina touched on this earlier. If you're a startup and you're delivering software, your appetite for risk is probably a lot higher. You have a lot less resources available, right? And thus, your definition of quality is widely different from your quality objective if you're in financial services, right? The one that always sticks in my mind, if you look at a lot of central banks, right, and you think about the settlement systems they have, almost every morning through those settlement systems, almost the entire GDP of that country goes through it to be settled, right? And if something goes wrong with that system or something happens, there's a high likelihood of pretty much the whole financial system of that country failing, right? So your appetite for risk is much, much lower. And, you're going to try and de-risk that as much as possible around your testing. But coming back to Rich's point as well, there is definitely a lot around culture here. I think we've all been in meetings where you've heard it from, some kind of executive, an organization, where they're talking about how we have to have 100% test coverage. We have to test everything. And I think the reality is you have to accept it's impossible to test everything. You have to focus your testing on the areas of risk. And really what you're trying to do is get a sense of confidence that actually the product, the deliverable, the software, whatever it is at a point where we're happy with the risk, that we can deploy this and it's not going to break and it's not going to, go against our business and crash everything down, right? And I think that's kind of where we have to get to. I don't know if that answered your question originally then, but that was just my thoughts as I was kind of listening.
No, it's good. No, it's great. I mean, I guess, to me, one of, Rich's sort of points there is really talking about, quality to who, right? Then so there's two points, I guess. One is, I saw you answer somebody in the chat around, whether the product is software only and that sort of stuff. I wouldn't mind a slightly more expanded answer, because I think that's really interesting. And the second is, I guess, what's a good measure of, I guess, perceived quality, or how would you try and measure the software quality of something? You mentioned monitoring a bit earlier. Yeah, I don't know if you've got some ideas there.
Yeah. So to Cornelia's question a little bit, right? So, is it a software only product, or is that part of a much wider product and project? I tend to agree with that. I think the impact of the software on most projects can be quite high. Or sometimes you even have projects where, because of, a lack of access to developers, sometimes you have something even worse than software being implemented, which should have really been software. One example of that I can give you is during COVID in the UK, the health ministry of some local county or something was taking in test results, and there was some automation running against that, but they didn't have access, or permissions to create databases or use real development resources. They don't have like a developer core, right, that they can go and access. And so this information was stored in Excel, and they're not developers. So they were, storing each new test result as a new column in the Excel, not a new row. So every day when the tests hit 65,000 and a little bit of change, no more tests would be recorded. And so every day in that one part of England, the number of positive tests was exactly the same to the number. And eventually somebody noticed and they fixed it. But that was actually caused by lack of development resources and a lack of including software in the project. But in general, I would agree, which is the bigger part of it is obviously the bigger impact it's going to have. When it comes to like having enough focus on quality, that can be very difficult, because a lot of these cases you can often essentially borrow against risk. If there are very, very impactful but unlikely outcomes, and you're just a person and you want to get promoted, you want to have a 80% chance you deliver this under budget, or a 20% chance it's full disaster, versus just 100% chance it's just okay, you might take that kind of judgment call, right? So I think in general, if you don't have somewhere where quality is measured and exposed, and if we don't really actually account for but very, very important risks with some of these projects, we don't see how it's interwoven with delivering these projects, we can get in a very, very difficult situation. So when it comes to measuring quality, there is the literal quality of things that are bona fide bugs and, things that are clear outages and defect leakage and all those kinds of things, support cases. Those are kind of pretty easy to measure. You can measure uptime and stuff like that. But it's harder if you kind of expand quality to think about like user experience and things that they're giving up on. For example, when I give up on a booking website because it's kind of reset me to the homepage a couple of times, or it's not understood my name, or it's kind of, done something strange, am I actually noticing all of those problems? Am I measuring that with my users? How much like lost commerce or how many other things are happening because people have essentially given up and not gone through the cost of reporting? So bugs that like don't raise to the cost that they report themselves, how many of those are we missing? I think is probably a common problem. And I think the last thing I would say is we're pretty good at reporting. The best practices are pretty good at reporting and monitoring for like modern services and microservices and things like that. But we haven't expanded that to things which aren't, say, just functional, yes or no. We haven't expanded it to quality of answers given by our AI products, or quality of experience in the same way that we have when we ask users to review their experience. I think that's one of the things that we probably don't have the full set of tooling for yet.
Love that. Good answer. I think there's a lot around sort of context, right? Context is sort of king in these sorts of scenarios. If you want a bank that gives you 10% on your savings, right, but you don't care if it's got a mobile app, you've got a very different experience to somebody who wants to be able to, chuck £10 to their mates after they've been down the pub, because it's just two different, it's two completely different requirements. James, I think you're quite vocal on your LinkedIn when it comes to some of these problems. So, I guess the question is let's start with just very simple, right? What can people do, right? So how can the software technology industry maybe sort of change their approach to go on the side of from your three, maybe just airing more towards good?
Yeah, it's an interesting question. I guess the biggest thing I'm kind of thinking about at the moment, and you'll see this if you go to the Curiosity website as well, is what I've been seeing in a lot of organizations is everybody kind of cares about developer productivity. And it's almost like developers have been put on this pedestal, amazing, fantastic, The software is great because of our developers, right? And I think the reality is we call this kind of the inner loop as the world of the developer, right? But the reality is there's an awful lot of stuff happening in software delivery that kind of wraps around that ecosystem, right? Which is what we call the outer loop. And it's things like requirements, it's things like testing, it's things like data, it's things like environments, right? And actually, to me, that is the most important bit, right? If you deliver poor quality requirements, the reality of you actually getting the right software at the end of that process is very unlikely. Also, the other end of that is your development team will probably spend a lot of time going on meetings, asking for clarifications over particular features, functionality, etc. Right? If we don't get our testing right in that outer loop, what's going to happen? Well, we're going to end up with either a lot of defects in production, or we're going to find those errors towards the tail end of our delivery lifecycle. And then we're going to end up, hampering productivity as a whole. But the reality is our team is probably going to end up doing an awful lot of firefighting to try and get control of these defects and get it all in a row, right? So I think my biggest piece of advice that, when I'm talking to organizations today, what am I recommending? It's stop focusing so much on the developer experience, stop focusing so much on development, developer productivity, etc. There's a much bigger piece here about how software is created, how it's delivered, how it's defined. And actually, if you spend more time in that outer loop, doing a little bit more earlier, setting yourself up for success, shifting left, introducing higher levels of quality to your requirements, to your data, to your testing, actually what we're seeing in a lot of organizations is that speeds up software delivery, but also as part of that, you end up with a much higher quality deliverable out the back end as well, right? So I think in summary, spend more time in the outer loop than the inner loop is my kind of mantra at the moment.
Yeah, cool. I love it. Lina, what do you think? Do you agree or disagree? And then I guess I'll ask you the question of who's responsible? Who's responsible for quality when it comes to better software?
Yeah, I really agree. I think there's that structural element that's so important to ensuring the actual quality of the deliverable. And if you're only focusing on one side of it, which is the developer world, and you're missing all of this other context, it's essentially the project is stopping halfway. And in terms of who's responsible, I really firmly believe it's a cultural mindset that an organization has. So I would say it's the leaders who are responsible for promoting that and prioritizing the quality over everything else. But culturally, within teams, within individuals, I think it's important to recognize that quality is the goal, that all of these other things are working towards the goal of having this quality outcome. In a previous life, I used to work in project management for a toy manufacturing company. And I think it's really interesting to see the parallels because the quality is so important in that industry because you're selling to young children. So everyone was very responsible for quality at their own individual stage. And of course, we had a dedicated section for specifically testing, and there's regulations you have to follow. But everyone took it very seriously at every single stage. And the people who were responsible for that last stage of testing actually spoke with the designers who were coming up with that initial structure of what the toy should even look like. So yeah, I'm a firm believer in shifting left and making it a cultural responsibility for everyone to value quality.
Love it. It's great. Rich, agree, disagree with those comments? And then maybe something on, maybe what's sort of some of the biggest challenges that you sort of see out in the market that sort of impact this, and maybe some ideas for getting past them.
Totally agree. For one, I think it's important to have accountability for quality, and then responsibility is a collective thing, right? I think I've seen it quite often, especially from a testing point of view. James kind of mentioned around the outer loop gets ignored. A lot of the times, organizations are going into things without any design collateral. Let's put it that way. They're rushed to doing some kind of development and then chuck it over the fence to test to say, figure out how it's supposed to work. And so what's the oracle to work with, right? Around what does good look like? I've seen that quite a lot. I think that's quite a problem within lots of organizations and organizational change when it comes to IT, to start shifting that kind of shared responsibility for what good looks like within the team, creates a lot more collaborative culture, and it also creates so much more efficiency in terms of flow through the team. Where's the biggest challenges? It's at the start, right, where these things are being defined, right? And quite often they aren't being defined. And that's a real big problem, right? Because you've got this whole development life cycle who are second guessing what does quality mean to whomever we're supposed to be delivering this to, right? We all talk about, requirements are half baked. Okay, so straight away there is some interpretation around what the expectation is that starts at the very beginning, and everybody goes off and does their own thing, right? We obviously have a modeling piece of software. It's quite interesting that we go into a lot of sessions demoing these things and, doing very quick proof of concepts with these organizations. They start having conversations between themselves around how systems are supposed to work. And straight away, it's the power of actually defining these things, having these early conversations up front. You've got practices like BDD and feature mapping and things like that. Really, really powerful things where you can eliminate lots of issues really, really early doors and get a common understanding around what we're going for. What is quality here? What are we actually going for? Those really early powerful conversations, they are so powerful. But yet so many organizations just don't do it because the perception that we need to be writing code overarches these really powerful and proven things.
Love that. That's great. Ben, do you agree? Or I guess my follow-up is, if you were to go into they were to join an organization today tasked with making their software better, what's the first, where would you start? What's the first thing that you're trying to?
Yeah,
it's a fake company, so you don't know the problems.
right. For sure. I deal with fake companies all the time. So I think I mostly agree, but the other case that I will give you is that I think the bar is slightly higher when we have more users. And if you just think about, how we've progressed and there's more software in it, there's more layers, there is more complexity. There are just more possible things going on and more possible things being tried, and the impact can be higher. So I do think that there's a lot of low likelihood things where, as we have more layers and each layer has been a little bit wobbly and we've got away with it for the past thing, I don't think that all testing is necessarily taking the view of it's reasonable to try and pursue almost bulletproof level of quality. I think that we've probably been focused on a good enough level, and especially in development or writing unit tests, we're not necessarily taking the attitude of proving it's correct. We're often taking the attitude of, hey, we've done some reasonable testing, we can fix it if it goes wrong. So I think there are methodologies, there's tooling, etc., out there for taking a slightly more proactive approach to critical things that many other things are built on. And when you consider the scale that we're often building against now, I think that's more important than it has been before, especially when we're reusing and building libraries and components like that. The thing that I was going to add to that when it comes to what would I look at first in a company that's, let's say they're having leak defect issues, they're having perception issues in terms of quality, or they're having a business issue in terms of retention, it would definitely be, what is the user's perception of quality? If there's straight up downtime, you'd probably start there. But I'm usually from the point of view of, for overall broad spectrum, it would be monitoring and understanding and talking to users and building from there. But then for some of the critical core components that are really important, or the core business things that need to be right every time, actually building an understanding and proving that, hey, these are built as they're intended. They're not built according to, not being broken or according to what we think the code should be. These are built as intended for, some core things, and trying to bulletproof those and going one at a time. Usually driven by where we think the defects are, but also based on what actually is important to customers and what the monitoring actually says in terms of causing issues, especially for those really core backbone components.
I think we're in agreement, right? In terms of, I don't think you can bulletproof anything, right? This is back to you can't prove everything to be absolute fine. It's almost in terms of that collective understanding of what's good enough. I think it has two parts to it, right? If you understand what's good enough, understand how much effort you need to put into it. And if it goes wrong, collectively, you got it wrong, right? Rather than the finger pointing. So the two elements to me of that early collaboration, that understanding, that transparency, and also the collective outcome at the end, right? Whether that's a success or not, it can only be a good thing if we're collectively owning what we did and why we did it, and maybe we should might change it for the future if it's wrong. But we all know why we're doing, or we're spending enough time doing certain things. Back to risk. Are certain elements well understood? Are things very, very risky for us? Do things generate a lot of revenue for us? Therefore, we can, apply a lot of lenses around what, to Ben always says, is how many calories have we got and where do we want to apply them, right? I think that's a really good.
I would come back with one thing on that, which is one other question I would ask, testers, developers would be, what are you not testing because it's too much effort, right? What do you feel unable or not in a position in terms of environment to be able to test? Because, if we're thinking what things are left on the table in terms of quality, which of them are just perceived to be too hard or too much effort, or we don't have the tooling or the environment for it, right? Because it might not be worth it for an individual developer or tester to, go through the heartache of convincing their management to, provide that to them. Oftentimes, data teams will be saying things like, hey, I'm not going to focus on that. Testers never need that. And testers never build those tests because they know that the data person, the first time isn't going to be able to provide it for them.
And to me, that's a healthy conversation, right? I had a scenario where we had a real world change where it's quite difficult. People who test Google Pay might know this. It's hard to try to replicate certain things in non-production, and therefore the risk of it going wrong is very low. And so we had those risk-based conversations around the fact, look, we will prove all these things out. This thing, not so much, but we know how these things work. We know the risk of not doing these things. The risk is low. Accountable person for product. Look, there's the scenario. We don't think we should do it. We should go forward into make that change. If it did go wrong, here's the rollback procedure. It's really low kind of risk. We should go ahead anyway. That's a real healthy place to be, right? Whereas I don't think that that's the case. You get silo to silo to silo to silo. Thing go wrong. Whose fault was it? Right? It's a very different kind of conversation, a way of working.
Yeah, agreed. Guys, we are sort of right at towards the end of this. I guess, James, I'm going to ask you the sort of final question summary, maybe. One, I'm a single person in a large organization. Maybe what can I do? What's your biggest sort of series of advice to somebody who sort of feels like that or is trying to make some sort of action change? And then just any, I guess, sort of closing comments, really.
Yeah, I think the biggest thing I've been excited about in the industry at the moment is, and this has been going on for the past 12 to 18 months, maybe a little bit longer now, is a lot of organizations have been introducing the role of a quality engineer. I think that's a fantastic role. And I think if an organization of that size doesn't have someone who's owning that quality engineering role, I think that should be step one, bring someone in to do that. Because to me, it's not someone who's just sat there doing testing, executing test cases, coming out with a test plan, etc. It's looking at the whole of software delivery more holistically, and it's looking at the whole process, and it's saying, where do we have inefficiencies today? And those inefficiencies could be, to Ben's point, it could be that actually we have a lot of defects that are there in production. It's going down a lot. Monitoring is actually the correct solution for us, and we're going to be very reactive. Or it could be that we're a bit more mature. We have that already. We don't have that many defects entering production, but, we're spending a lot of time in testing. It's a big bottleneck for us. How can we be a bit more proactive, shift left, and introduce our tests a lot more earlier in the delivery lifecycle, right? So I think it's just more looking holistically at a process. Where are the gaps? Where are the problems? How can we improve? And that's probably where I would go. And I think quality engineers, at least the ones I've met, very intelligent, very capable looking at that viewpoint and figuring it out.
Fantastic. I think we are there or thereabouts. I think, firstly, thank you very much, James, Rich, Ben, Lina. Hopefully I found it super interesting. Hopefully people watching did too. There's some really good viewpoints there. No, Lina tried to throw Booking.com maybe under the bus at one point, though she said no name, so that's okay. I would just like to promote our next webinar. So myself and James will be back, but accompanied by Hugh Price. So two of the co-founders of the company. We're going to be talking about sort of the new era of test data. You've got, experiences, problems, things that you're trying to sort of solve in this space at the moment. We're going to get into it, and we're going to sort of really go to town in talking about some of the new things we see in the industry, some of the areas that we ourselves are trying to improve on, some of the product areas that we're trying to sort of solve, and ultimately try and sort of predict the future a little bit when it comes into what's going on, why we're making the choices that we're making as a company, and that sort of stuff. So it's going to be hopefully a really good webinar. I'm not sure I can say that because I'm going to be involved, but I'm sure it will be. And we can hope we hope for you again. Appreciate your time. Appreciate your openness and honesty when it comes to the questions, and look forward to the next one.
Thank you so much, everyone. Thank you, guys.
Thank you very much, everyone.